Matthew and Mark, the rest of the sentence is, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. Mark gives us at least the time of day, and it was the third hour when they crucified him. And then Matthew specifically says, and over his head they put the charge against him which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Now again, let's note, because by the way, speaking of Bart Ehrman thinks that none of us ever do what we've been doing for the past, is it 10 years? Or is it 96? Was it 90? It was 96? Okay, so we're coming up on, we're gonna beat 10 years. It's gonna be close, but we're September of 96. Okay, so we've got time. We got to beat it by a little more than that. But Bart Ehrman is absolutely convinced and tells his audiences that believers like us, we just read Matthew, and then we read Mark, and that sounds like Matthew, and then we read Luke, and that sounds like Mark, and read John, that sounds a little bit like the others, and that we never read them in parallel, which is what we've been doing for a decade. I know it's not been a decade every Sunday. I've been traveling a lot over the past 5 or 6 years, but we've spent a long time. I'd be interested if we have a means of actually counting. Is there a series on the synoptics, or is it just Sunday school? We actually have to go back and count, wouldn't we? Yeah. It would be interesting to see how many. I would estimate probably right on 300. Probably about 300 studies so far in the synoptics, which makes sense. Is worth section 344, so that sort of averages out. But he tells all of his audiences, this is something that we never do, because if we did, we just wouldn't believe these things. But we've done this for so long now that we look at this and we see that Matthew has, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Mark and Luke simply have, "This is the King of the Jews," or "the King of the Jews." And John has the longest description, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And then John gives the much extended discussion. Many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Latin and in Greek. The chief priests, the Jews, then said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews," but this man said, "I am King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and made 4 parts, one for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was without seam, woven from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scriptures. "They parted my garments among them, and my clothing they cast lots." The soldiers did this, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now there is a huge, by the way, I'm just going to note this and not going to go into it, but there is a huge discussion of the identity specifically of these women, how many women there were, how to punctuate it, because there's just a bunch of Marys. Mary, 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 and Mary, Mary. Mary and Mary, Mary. And then there was another Mary. I mean, there are Marys everywhere. And it becomes somewhat relevant in trying to figure out what the relationships between all of them were. And the only reason I mention it is that it has come up. I had to deal with it really in depth once because of an argument about the perpetual virginity of Mary and whether Mary had children. So it's relevant to argument with Roman Catholic apologists, and it can get very deep, and there are a number of articles that talk about the number of women at the cross that we won't go into now, but I just let you know that there is a big brouhaha about that. And a disciple whom he loved standing near, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the woman took her. The disciple took her to his own home. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the point is, you will have people who will say, "See, what was written above Jesus' head? Or is it even above Jesus' head? Only Matthew says it's above Jesus. Well, I'm not sure where else. Well, it says inscription over him in Luke, so I guess that. But Mark gives the time, but doesn't say where the inscription is. Well, where else are you going to put it? It could be on the side of the cross someplace, on the back. Yeah, that's not going to make any sense. But the idea is, well, did it say this is Jesus? Was the term Nazareth included? And this is something Bart Ehrman would do. It depends on which gospel you read. Well, once again, by now we've read through so many parallel accounts that we've become accustomed to going, well, wait a minute. None of them say this is Jonah, vicegerent of Tiberias. Okay, that would be a contradiction. That would be identifying this person as someone else, the position as something else. The point is, especially, how do you know, since according to John, now if we didn't have John, but it's written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, might have been different between those three? Which one is John giving us? Which one's Matthew giving us? Which one's Mark giving us? There's all sorts of reasons, and even if they're all giving us the same thing, they're all giving us the same information, some with a little fuller rendering than others. That's all the difference between them is. And once you start seeing people focusing upon that level of, well, if it's going to be accurate, it has to be a photocopy reproduction, rather than they're all giving the exact same information, and John even goes so far as to tell us multiple languages. And since John obviously had connections to the high priest's circles, he is aware of the fact that the Jews actually come to Pilate and object to the wording. And at this point you can tell Pilate, they already pulled the stunt of no friend of Caesar's. They've pretty much burned their last favors. And you can sort of tell that in Pilate's response. What I've written, I've written. If you don't want to disappear quietly in the night, shut up. You can just that's sort of written between the lines in the textual variant someplace in Pilate's words at that point. But you can sort of sense it. You can hear it coming. But again, it's just a simple matter of how much data you provide there. It's not contradictory data unless you have this absurd